Attention! Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time when you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The winter of 1846 brought more than just frost to Blackwood County, Virginia. It carried with it a silence that would stretch across decades, a silence that began with the curious case of the Harrington estate, located some 7 miles east of the county seat, nestled between rolling hills that kept secrets as effectively as the family that owned them. The property, with its imposing Georgian architecture and 600 acres of working land, appeared to visitors as the embodiment of southern prosperity. But local records from that period describe an unusual demographic peculiarity. While most plantations in the region reported equal numbers of male and female enslaved persons, Harrington showed a marked disproportion. Nearly 3 times as many female slaves of childbearing age were registered to the property between 1838 and 1846. This detail might have remained merely a statistical oddity, buried in county ledgers, had it not been for the discovery made in the summer of 1968. During renovation work on the old Harrington house, then owned by the Historical Society of Virginia, workers discovered a false wall in what had once been the east wing cellar. Behind it lay a small room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, containing what appeared to be medical implements and a leather-bound journal. The journal was water-damaged, but several pages remained legible enough to raise questions that would never be fully answered. The records indicate that the journal belonged to Elizabeth Harrington, second wife of plantation owner Thomas Harrington. What followed was a limited investigation, conducted primarily by Professor James Whitaker of the University of Virginia. His findings were documented in a 40-page report that was subsequently archived in 1969, classified and essentially forgotten until portions were declassified under the Freedom of Information Act in the mid-1950s. The Harrington case represents what historians refer to as a documentary gap, where official records exist but tell only a fraction of the story. Where the records end, local accounts begin, passed through generations in whispers. This is the story of what happened at Harrington Estate during those cold months of 1846, when the birth records of Blackwood County began to show discrepancies that no one seemed willing to question. Thomas Harrington was born in 1800 to a family of moderate wealth and social standing. Following his father's death in 1822, he inherited the family property and expanded it considerably through shrewd investments in tobacco and cotton. According to census records, by 1830, the Harrington estate was among the 10 largest in the county. His first marriage, to Mary Sullivan of Richmond, produced no children before her death of consumption in 1835. Tax records and property deeds indicate that Thomas remained unmarried for nearly 3 years before wedding Elizabeth Carrington, 22 years his junior, and the daughter of a prominent merchant from Norfolk. The marriage coincided with Thomas Harrington's rise in local politics and an expansion of his household staff. Church records from St. Matthew's Episcopal note the Harringtons as generous benefactors and pillars of Christian charity. Elizabeth, in particular, was described in a parish newsletter as a woman of exceeding compassion for the less fortunate, whose management of household affairs reflects the most virtuous attention to Christian duty. Behind this veneer of Christian propriety, however, the day-to-day reality of Harrington Estate operated with clockwork precision. Elizabeth maintained what one former house servant later described as a household run tighter than any ship. Every morning began at 5:30, regardless of season. Meals were served at precisely the same time each day. The house was cleaned according to a strict schedule. Mondays for linens, Tuesdays for floors, Wednesdays for silver and brass. What stands out in accounts from the time is not the rigor of this schedule, which was common in large households, but the silence with which it was maintained. According to testimonies collected decades later, Elizabeth prohibited unnecessary conversation among the household staff. One account suggests she had particular disdain for laughter or any signs of familiarity between household members. More unusual was the segregation she enforced between the house servants and the field workers. While such distinctions were common on plantations, Elizabeth's rules were reportedly extreme. House servants were forbidden from speaking to field workers under any circumstances. Meals were taken separately, and separate living quarters were maintained at a considerable distance from one another. Most notable was Elizabeth's personal management of what was called the women's quarter, a separate building located behind the main house where female slaves of childbearing age were housed. According to property records, this building was constructed in 1839, approximately 1 year after Elizabeth's arrival. The building, unlike typical slave quarters of the period, featured individual rooms with doors that, according to architectural assessments conducted in the 1960s, locked from the outside. These details might suggest nothing more than an unusually controlling mistress. However, county birth records from 1840 to 1846 show a curious pattern. The Harrington plantation recorded an unusually high birth rate among its enslaved population, nearly double that of comparable properties in the region. More curious still, these records show a marked increase in the purchase of young women between the ages of 14 and 20, often acquired from estates as far away as South Carolina and Georgia. What makes this pattern particularly unusual is that, according to import-export ledgers from the Richmond Port Authority, the Harrington plantation was not expanding its agricultural production during this period. In fact, tobacco output decreased slightly between 1842 and 1845. The economic rationale for such acquisitions remains unclear. It was in November of 1846 when the first hint of irregularity appears in the historical record. William Farnsworth of Charlottesville, to a colleague in Philadelphia, discovered among the Farnsworth family papers in 1952, makes a bleak reference to the unusual situation at H Estate, which I have been called to attend no less than 3 times this autumn, and which I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with professional ethics. The letter continues with a request for advice regarding cases where a physician's obligation to patient welfare may conflict with legal and social expectations. The colleague's response has never been found, nor is there any record of further correspondence on the matter. A letter from what we do know is that Dr. Farnsworth's ledgers show 3 visits to the Harrington estate in October of 1846, each one extending overnight. This was unusual for the period, as doctors typically made brief visits unless a patient was near death. No death certificates were filed in connection with these visits. The following week, records from Blackwood County Court indicate that Thomas Harrington filed papers to transfer ownership of 5 female slaves, all between the ages of 16 and 19, to his wife, Elizabeth's name. Such transfers between spouses were not uncommon for tax purposes, but the selective nature of this transfer, specifically young women, raises questions in retrospect. Later that month, an advertisement appeared in the Blackwood County Gazette announcing that Thomas Harrington would be traveling north on business affairs and would be absent from the county until spring. Parish records confirm his absence from church services throughout the winter of 1846 and into 1847. During this period, Elizabeth Harrington remained at the estate. The house account books, meticulously maintained in her handwriting, show regular purchases of medical supplies from the county apothecary, specifically laudanum, ergot, and various tonics advertised for female complaints. The quantities purchased exceed what would typically be required for a household of that size. The winter of 1846 was, by all accounts, particularly harsh. Snow fell heavily in December, and temperatures remained below freezing through February. This isolation would have been unremarkable had it not been for what occurred in the early spring of 1847. According to county records, between March and May of 1847, the Harrington plantation registered the births of 11 children to 9 enslaved mothers. This unusually high number and concentration of births would normally suggest a coincidence of timing or perhaps a record-keeping anomaly. However, subsequent events suggest something more deliberate was at work. In June of 1847, Thomas Harrington returned to the estate. Within 2 weeks of his return, Elizabeth dismissed the overseer who had managed the property in her husband's absence. The man, Joseph Miller, subsequently left the county, but not before reportedly expressing concerns to the local sheriff about unnatural happenings at the Harrington place. No formal complaint was filed, and the sheriff's records contain no further mention of the matter. It was around this time that local residents began to notice changes in Thomas Harrington's demeanour. Previously known as a sociable figure at county functions and church gatherings, he became withdrawn. A notation in the journal of neighbouring plantation owner Edward Sinclair describes Thomas as altered in countenance and spirit, as though bearing some internal burden that has aged him beyond his years. Parish records show that the Harringtons' church attendance became irregular, with Thomas often appearing alone. When Elizabeth did attend, witnesses later recalled that she maintained an unusually rigid posture and spoke to no one beyond the most basic pleasantries. The summer of 1847 brought another unusual development. Without apparent economic justification, Thomas Harrington began selling off parcels of his land. Between July and November of that year, property records show he divested nearly 150 acres, approximately 1/4 of his holdings. The transactions were conducted through an agent in Richmond rather than locally, which was unusual for the time. More significantly, shipping records from the port of Norfolk indicate that in September of 1847, 9 children between the ages of 3 months and 3 years were transported to New Orleans, accompanied by a representative of the Harrington estate. The children were listed as property for sale, with no mothers accompanying them. The practice of selling children separately from their mothers, while not unheard of, was considered harsh even by the standards of the time. It typically occurred only in cases of extreme financial necessity or as punishment. Neither circumstance appears to have applied to the Harrington estate, which remained financially solvent according to tax records. What happened next is documented primarily through the fragmentary journal discovered in 1968. The legible entries, spanning from October to December 1847, reveal Elizabeth Harrington's preoccupation with what she termed the breeding project. The entries are clinical in tone, referring to enslaved women by numbers rather than names, with notations about physical characteristics, menstrual cycles, and reproductive outcomes. One particularly disturbing entry, dated November 12, 1847, reads, "Subject 7 has proven most productive, having delivered 3 viable offspring in 4 years. Have increased her rations accordingly and moved her to the preferred quarters. Subjects 3 and 9 continue to resist the process. Have consulted Dr. F regarding methods to ensure compliance without reducing value." The Dr. F referenced is presumed to be Dr. Farnsworth, though his role in these events remains unclear. His own records show that he ceased visiting the Harrington estate after February 1847 and subsequently relocated his practice to Richmond in early 1848. By December 1847, the journal entries become increasingly erratic. Elizabeth begins to express paranoia, suggesting that the household staff were watching with judgment and that Thomas was weakening in resolve. The final legible entry, dated December 23rd, contains a troubling passage. The girls must understand that their purpose here transcends their understanding. What we do serves a greater economic necessity. Those who cannot accept their role must be removed from the equation. The girls referenced appear to be Elizabeth's own daughters from her marriage to Thomas, Margaret, age 8, and Eleanor, age 6 at the time of this entry. What role these children played or were intended to play in Elizabeth's project remains one of the most disturbing unanswered questions of the case. County records show that on December 26, 1847, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Harrington mansion. The fire was contained, and no deaths were reported. However, in January 1848, Thomas Harrington abruptly relocated his family to Richmond, leaving the estate in the care of a new overseer. Church records indicate that Elizabeth was not present when the family appeared at St. Paul's Episcopal in Richmond in February 1848. Thomas provided no explanation for her absence to the parish. However, admission records from the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Staunton, Virginia, dated January 20th, 1848, list an E.H. admitted for nervous exhaustion and delusions of persecution. The patient remained institutionalized until her death from pneumonia in 1852. Thomas Harrington never returned to the estate, choosing instead to lease the land to tenant farmers. He remained in Richmond with his daughters until his death in 1863. The daughters never married, and both worked as teachers at the Richmond Female Seminary until their deaths in the early 1900s. The Harrington estate itself changed hands multiple times before being acquired by the Historical Society in 1955. The Women's Quarter building was demolished in 1870 during a renovation by subsequent owners. No photographs of it exist. What actually transpired at the Harrington estate between 1846 and 1847 can never be fully known. The fragmentary evidence suggests a systematic attempt by Elizabeth Harrington to increase the enslaved population of the plantation through forced breeding, potentially with the initial cooperation of her husband. The unusual medical arrangements, the segregation of young women, the high birth rates and the subsequent sale of children all point to a calculated economic strategy that went beyond the already inhumane standards of American slavery. More disturbing are the implications of the final journal entries, which suggest that Elizabeth may have intended to involve her own daughters in this system as they approached adolescence. Whether this represented a psychological break or the logical extension of her existing moral framework remains a matter of speculation. The historical record falls silent on many crucial details. No testimonies from the enslaved women were ever recorded. Dr. Farnsworth never spoke publicly about his involvement. The overseer, Joseph Miller, disappears from all records after leaving Blackwood County. The children sold to New Orleans cannot be traced through existing documents. What we are left with is a case study in the darkest aspects of human nature, how systems of oppression create environments where additional layers of exploitation can flourish behind closed doors. The Harrington case reveals not just the institutional horrors of slavery, but the intimate terrors that could exist within that framework, particularly for women whose bodies became sites of economic calculation. In 1969, when Professor Whitaker attempted to publish his findings, he reportedly received anonymous threats. His report was classified by unnamed government officials and remained unavailable to researchers until the partial declassification in the 1950s. Even now, certain pages remain redacted. The Harrington House still stands today, restored and maintained as a historical site that focuses primarily on its architectural significance. Tours of the property make no mention of Elizabeth's breeding project or the hidden room where her journal was found. The cellar where the room was discovered has been converted to storage space, the false wall rebuilt without indication of what once lay behind it. Local residents still occasionally report unusual sounds from the property at night, crying that seems to come from multiple sources simultaneously. Historians attribute this to the house's poor acoustics and the wind patterns common to the region. Others suggest that sounds may carry from a nearby modern farm where livestock is kept. In 2003, during a routine geophysical survey of the grounds, ground-penetrating radar identified what appeared to be a mass grave, approximately 100 yards behind where the women's quarters once stood. The Historical Society declined to investigate further, citing concerns about disturbing the landscape of the historical property. The final fate of most of the women who lived through Elizabeth Harrington's breeding project remains unknown. County records show that when the estate was finally sold in 1871, after Thomas Harrington's death, Only 3 enslaved persons remained on the property, all elderly men who had worked in the fields. What happened to the young women who had once been housed in the separate quarters? The historical record offers no answers. Perhaps the most telling epilogue to this story comes from a letter written by Eleanor Harrington in 1900, discovered in the archives of the Richmond Female Seminary. Addressed to a former student who had inquired about her family history, the letter states only, "There are matters regarding one's ancestry that are best left unexplored. I have made my peace with God regarding my mother's actions and my father's complicity. I would advise you to focus your historical interests elsewhere, as some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed again." Eleanor died 6 years later, taking whatever knowledge she possessed to her grave. Her sister Margaret had preceded her in death, having never spoken publicly about her childhood. The Harrington case reminds us that history is not merely a collection of facts, but also a record of silences, things unspoken, undocumented, deliberately obscured. It reminds us that behind the formal language of property records, tax documents, and church registries lie human experiences that the written record can only hint at. Today, the rolling hills of Blackwood County appear peaceful. The road leading to the old Harrington estate is well maintained, lined with interpretive markers discussing the architectural and agricultural innovations of 19th century Virginia. On quiet nights, when the wind blows from the east, some say you can still hear faint sounds coming from the direction of where the women's quarters once stood, not screams or wails, but something more haunting, the sound of women singing softly to infants who would soon be taken away. Those children, born of coercion and calculated breeding, disappeared into the broader enslaved population of the American South. Their descendants walk among us today, carrying genetic heritage from a place whose darkest secrets remain partially buried in the soil of Virginia and in the gaps between historical documents. Perhaps some secrets should remain buried, but perhaps others need to be excavated, examined, and acknowledged, not with sensationalism, but with the solemn recognition that the past is never truly past, and that the echoes of Elizabeth Harrington's breeding project continue to reverberate through American society in ways we are only beginning to understand. In 1957, a descendant of one of the neighboring families reportedly visited the Harrington estate and stood for a long time staring at the empty space where the women's quarters had once been. According to the tour guide on duty that day, the visitor finally turned and said, "The worst kind of haunting isn't supernatural. It's the knowledge that human beings can do such things to one another and then go sit in church on Sunday as if nothing happened." The visitor never returned. The tour guide included this anecdote in her report to the Historical Society, which subsequently instituted a policy prohibiting guides from discussing unverified historical claims with visitors. And so the silence continues, interrupted only occasionally by researchers like Professor Whitaker, who recognized in the fragmented journal of Elizabeth Harrington something beyond the already established horrors of American slavery, a calculated system of reproductive exploitation that treated women not merely as property, but as machinery for the production of wealth. When the sun sets over the old Harrington estate, the restored Georgian facade glows golden in the fading light. It looks peaceful, prosperous, a testament to an architectural tradition that Americans have long admired. Few visitors notice the peculiar arrangement of the East Wing, rebuilt after the fire of 1847, with windows placed just a little too high for anyone inside to see out clearly. Fewer still question why a property of such size would have had such a small family cemetery, or why no graves of enslaved persons have ever been formally identified on the grounds. Some questions remain unanswered, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because we hesitate to look for it. The Harrington case stands as a reminder that behind the formal facades of history lie human stories of terrible intimacy, stories that continue to shape our world in ways we may never fully comprehend. In 1963, a graduate student named Sarah Collins stumbled upon a reference to the Harrington case while researching her dissertation on women's economic roles in pre-Civil War Virginia. Intrigued by the unusual notations in county birth records, she began pulling at threads that led her deeper into the story. Her academic advisor cautioned her against pursuing the topic, suggesting it was too speculative and insufficiently documented for serious scholarship. Collins persisted, traveling to courthouses and archives across Virginia to piece together the fragmentary evidence. It was she who first connected the Harrington estate's unusually high birth rates to the architectural anomalies of the women's quarters. In her research notes, preserved at the University of Virginia's special collections, she wrote, "What emerges is not merely a case of the exploitation common to all slavery, but a deliberate, systematic program of reproductive control designed by a woman and implemented with clinical precision. Her dissertation was never completed." University records indicate that she withdrew from the program in 1964, citing personal reasons. Former classmates, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled that she became increasingly paranoid during her research, claiming that she was being followed and that documents she had previously accessed were suddenly being restricted. One former colleague reported receiving a letter from Collins in 1965, sent from an address in Oregon, in which she wrote, "I understand now why the Harrington daughters never spoke of what they witnessed. Some knowledge changes you irrevocably. I have burned my notes and suggest you forget I ever mentioned the name Harrington to you." What Collins discovered, or believed she discovered, that caused such a reaction remains unknown. Her research materials disappeared from her university office before her withdrawal. When Professor Whitaker began his own investigation 3 years later, he made no mention of Collins or her work, though university records would have shown her research focus. The question of what happened to the enslaved women after the Harrington family relocated to Richmond in 1848 represents perhaps the most disturbing gap in the historical record. Tax documents show that Thomas Harrington continued to own the women as property, but they do not appear in subsequent Richmond household records. Were they sold, relocated to another property? The documentary trail ends abruptly. One possible clue appears in the diary of Abigail Pembroke, wife of a Richmond physician, dated April 1848. She writes of a peculiar encounter at a society gathering. "Met T.H. this evening, recently arrived from the county. When I inquired after his wife's health, he replied only that she was indisposed, and changed the subject with marked discomfort. More curious was his response when Mrs. Fairchild asked after the unusual number of young women she had observed being escorted to his carriage house late one evening. He claimed they were merely household staff in transit to another property, yet his hand trembled so violently that he spilled his wine. I observe that his daughters, though present, appear unusually subdued and will not meet the gaze of any adults who address them." This reference suggests that at least some of the women from the estate were initially brought to Richmond. However, no further mentions appear in any known documents. City tax records from 1849 show Thomas Harrington paying tax on only 3 enslaved persons, described as house servants, all male. The fate of the children born during the 1846 to 1847 period is equally obscure. Beyond the shipping records indicating that 9 were sent to New Orleans, no further documentation exists that would allow them to be traced. They disappeared into the larger system of American slavery, their origins and the circumstances of their conception erased from the record. The silence surrounding the Harrington case extends beyond mere gaps in documentation. It suggests an active process of suppression, both contemporary to the events and in subsequent decades. The reluctance of officials to investigate Joseph Miller's concerns, the withdrawal of Dr. Farnsworth from the county, the classified status of Professor Whitaker's report until the 1950s, all suggest a recognition that some aspects of the Harrington story exceeded even the normalized brutality of the slave system. Perhaps most telling is the absence of oral history. Unlike many plantations, where stories passed down through generations of formerly enslaved families preserve accounts of what happened, the Harrington estate produced no such narratives. This absence itself is informative. It suggests either that the women involved did not survive to tell their stories, or that the experiences were too traumatic to be verbalized and transmitted. In 1977, construction workers excavating for a new subdivision approximately 3 miles from the former Harrington estate uncovered human remains. Archaeological assessment determined they were the remains of 7 individuals, all female, all between the ages of 15 and 25, buried in unmarked graves sometime in the mid-19th century. The remains showed evidence of multiple pregnancies in each woman. County officials quickly reburied the remains in the local cemetery with minimal investigation, citing limited resources and the impossibility of identification. Was there a connection to the Harrington case? No definitive link was ever established. The land had changed hands multiple times since the 1840s, and no records indicated a connection to the Harrington family. Yet the profile of the remains, young women who had borne multiple children, aligns disturbingly well with what we know of Elizabeth's breeding project. The lack of further investigation into these remains mirrors the broader pattern of silence surrounding the Harrington case. It represents what historian Barbara Fields has called the conspiracy of documentation, the way in which the written record systematically excludes the experiences of those deemed unworthy of historical attention. What we do know with certainty is that Thomas Harrington never remarried after Elizabeth's institutionalization and death. He lived another 15 years, managing his remaining financial affairs from Richmond and gradually selling off most of his assets. His will, preserved in the Richmond court records, contains a curious provision. To my daughters Margaret and Eleanor, I leave the sum of $10,000 each, with the stipulation that they never return to Blackwood County, nor make any claim upon the former family estate, regardless of what inducements or inquiries may be directed to them in future years. This provision suggests that Thomas feared something, perhaps revelations about what had occurred on the estate, perhaps legal consequences, perhaps simply the psychological impact of returning to the site of traumatic experiences. By the time of his death in 1863, his once substantial fortune had dwindled considerably. Whatever his concerns, the daughters honored his wishes. Neither ever returned to Blackwood County, according to local records. Margaret Harrington died in 1894 at the age of 55. Her death certificate lists the cause as complications of female complaint, a vague term that could encompass any number of conditions. She never married and left her estate to her sister, Eleanor. Eleanor lived longer, dying in 1906 at the age of 65. Her personal papers, donated to the Richmond Female Seminary where she had taught for over 30 years, reveal little about her early life. They focus primarily on her teaching work and her involvement with the Episcopal Church. The only oblique reference to her childhood appears in a draft of a letter to a former student who had experienced family trauma. I understand better than you might suppose what it means to witness things no child should see and to carry that knowledge through life. The burden does not lighten, but one learns to stand straighter beneath it. The most compelling evidence that Eleanor retained clear memories of what happened at the Harrington estate comes from the testimony of her housekeeper, recorded in 1928 as part of a local history project. The woman, Mary Jenkins, reported that Miss Harrington suffered from recurrent nightmares throughout her life. She would wake screaming about the women in the rooms and the crying that never stopped, Jenkins recalled. On her deathbed, she kept asking if they had been given proper burials, though she would not say who they were. In 1871, following Thomas Harrington's death, an advertisement appeared in the Richmond Inquirer offering the Harrington estate for sale. The description emphasized the property's agricultural potential and fine dwelling house, recently renovated after fire damage. No mention was made of outbuildings or slave quarters. The property sold for approximately 60% of its pre-war assessed value. The new owners, the Williams family, reported no unusual occurrences during their 20-year ownership. However, servants employed at the house during this period later described feeling watched in certain areas of the property, particularly near the site where the women's quarters had stood. One former cook, interviewed in 1910, claimed that on still nights the sound of women singing lullabies could sometimes be heard coming from the empty field behind the house. The Williams children would not play in that field, she recalled. They said it felt too sad there. The property changed hands several more times before being purchased by the Historical Society of Virginia in 1955. By then, most physical traces of its darkest chapter had been erased. The women's quarters had been demolished. The cellar room where Elizabeth's journal was later found had been sealed behind a false wall. The field where the unmarked graves may have been located had been planted with ornamental gardens. The discovery of the hidden room and journal in 1968 occurred during renovations intended to prepare the house for public tours. The construction foreman who found the room reported that his men refused to continue working in the cellar after the discovery, claiming they heard women's voices whispering when alone in the space. The journal itself presents a troubling artifact. The portions that remained legible revealed Elizabeth Harrington's clinical detachment in describing what can only be termed reproductive exploitation. She referred to enslaved women by numbers rather than names and evaluated them based on breeding potential and offspring quality. More disturbing were references to the training program for the girls, which some researchers interpret as referring to her daughters. Professor Whitaker's report, even in its declassified portions, treads carefully around this possibility, noting only that certain passages suggest an intention to perpetuate the system across generations. However, a staff member at the Western State Lunatic Asylum who had contact with Elizabeth during her institutionalization later reported that she frequently spoke of preparing her daughters to continue the family business. Given that the Harringtons had no conventional business interests that would have involved the daughters, this statement takes on a more sinister interpretation in light of the journal's contents. The most contentious aspect of the Harrington case involves the question of whether Elizabeth intended to incorporate her daughters into her breeding project as they approached adolescence. The journal entries are ambiguous on this point. The question of Thomas Harrington's knowledge and complicity remains equally difficult to resolve. The documentary evidence suggests initial cooperation, the transfer of young female slaves to Elizabeth's name, the construction of the separate women's quarters, the unusual medical arrangements, his subsequent actions, the fire, Elizabeth's institutionalization, the family's abrupt relocation, the daughter's education and independence suggest either a change of heart or an attempt to distance himself and his children from Elizabeth's activities. The financial records tell their own story. The plantation's profitability increased dramatically between 1842 and 1847, despite decreased agricultural output. The sale of enslaved children to the New Orleans market appears to account for this discrepancy. Southern law considered children born to enslaved women to be the property of the mother's owner, making Elizabeth's breeding project entirely legal, if morally repugnant even by contemporary standards. This legal framework created the conditions for the Harrington case and countless others like it that may never have been documented. The economic incentives of the slave system naturally led to the commodification of reproduction. What distinguishes the Harrington case is the systematic, clinical approach revealed in Elizabeth's journal. The carefully maintained records, the selective breeding, the medical involvement, the calculated separation of mothers and children. The Harrington case offers a window into what historian Stephanie Camp has called the intimate geography of bondage, the ways in which enslaved women's bodies became sites of economic and reproductive control. It reveals the particular vulnerability of enslaved women to exploitation not only by male slave owners, but by white women who, restricted in their own economic activities, found power through controlling the reproduction of women they owned. The historical significance of the case extends beyond its immediate horror. It illuminates the complex intersections of gender, race, and power in the antebellum South. Elizabeth Harrington, herself constrained by the patriarchal structures of her society, created a system of exploitation that targeted those even more vulnerable than herself. Her actions remind us that oppression does not automatically create solidarity among the oppressed. It can sometimes lead to the replication of oppressive structures down the social hierarchy. Today, the Harrington estate stands as a popular tourist destination, its dark history largely sanitized for public consumption. Tours focus on the architectural features of the house, the furniture, the gardens. Guides mention that the property was once a working plantation, but provide few details about the lives of the enslaved people who lived there. No mention is made of the breeding project or the women's quarters. In 2010, a proposal to create an interpretive center addressing the site's connection to reproductive exploitation in slavery was rejected by the Historical Society's Board of Directors, who cited concerns about visitor experience and historical certainty. The site's official guidebook contains a single paragraph acknowledging that, like many plantations of the period, Harrington was part of the larger system of American slavery, with all its attendant injustices. This sanitization represents the final silence in a case defined by silences. The voices of the women who lived and died within Elizabeth Harrington's system remain unheard. Their experiences, the physical pain, the emotional trauma of having children taken from them, the daily indignities, can only be imagined based on fragmentary evidence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Harrington case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. How many women passed through the women's quarters during Elizabeth's management of the estate? What were their names? What happened to those who resisted the process, as Elizabeth's journal euphemistically described it? How many children were born and sold away? What became of them? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. In 1982, an elderly woman visited the Harrington estate during a public tour. According to the guide on duty that day, she stood for a long time looking out the window toward where the women's quarters had once stood. When asked if she had a connection to the property, she replied, "My great-grandmother was born here. She never spoke of it, except to say that no god she could believe in would permit such a place to exist." The woman left no name and never returned. Her claim cannot be verified through existing records, yet it stands as a reminder that the human consequences of what happened at Harrington Estate continue to reverberate through generations in ways both documented and undocumented. The Harrington case represents a dark chapter in American history, not as an aberration, but as an extreme manifestation of the logic inherent in the slave system. It reminds us that behind the formal language of property records and legal documents lay human experiences of unimaginable suffering. It challenges us to consider how systems of oppression create environments where additional layers of exploitation can flourish behind closed doors. Most importantly, it reminds us of the power of silence, how effectively the voices of the vulnerable can be erased from historical records, how easily uncomfortable truths can be obscured, how readily societies can choose not to know what happened in their midst. As the sun sets over the rolling hills of what was once Blackwood County, the Harrington house stands as it has for nearly 2 centuries, its Georgian symmetry pleasing to the eye, its dark secrets largely undisturbed. Visitors walk through rooms where Elizabeth once planned her breeding project, unaware of the calculations that took place there. They admire the craftsmanship of woodwork created by enslaved hands whose owners' names were never recorded. And somewhere, perhaps, the descendants of the women who survived Elizabeth Harrington's system carry fragments of that history within them, not as documented knowledge, but as inherited trauma, as family silences, as unanswered questions about ancestors whose experiences were deemed unworthy of historical record. The true horror of the Harrington case lies not in sensational details, but in its ordinary legal reality. that such a system could exist within the bounds of law and social acceptance, that its victims could be so thoroughly silenced that its perpetrators could attend church on Sundays with their community none the wiser. It reminds us that the most terrible aspects of history often hide not in dramatic events, but in quiet rooms where power operates without witness or record. In the end, what we know about what happened at Harrington Estate between 1846 and 1847 comes to us through fragments: a water-damaged journal, inconsistent birth records, architectural anomalies, cryptic letters, second-hand accounts. The full truth remains elusive, obscured by time and by the systematic erasure of enslaved people's experiences from the historical record. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Harrington case, that history is not merely what is documented, but also what is deliberately left undocumented, not just what is remembered, but also what is consciously forgotten. It stands as a reminder that the past is never truly past, that its echoes continue to shape our present in ways both recognized and unrecognized. As Eleanor Harrington wrote in that letter to her former student, "Some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed again." The door to understanding what truly happened at Harrington Estate may never be fully opened, but even its partial opening reveals truths about our history that remain relevant today, about power and vulnerability, about the commodification of human reproduction, about the silencing of inconvenient truths. The hills of Virginia keep their secrets well. But if we listen closely, we might still hear the echoes of those who lived and suffered at Harrington Estate, not in supernatural hauntings, but in the gaps between historical documents, in the questions that remain unanswered, in the silence that still surrounds one of the darkest chapters in American history.